is Tara Trammell, and she is a postdoctoral fellow with Diane Pataki in the Department of Biology at the University of Utah. In the spring of 2015, she will start her new faculty position at the University of Delaware as the John Bartram Professor of Urban Forestry. She has conducted research in the field of urban ecology for over 10 years. She received a PhD and a master's in biology from the University of Louisiana and a bachelor's in mathematics from Berea College. We are super excited to have Tara here with us, and with that, I will turn it over to her. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Meredith, for the introduction. I am very happy to be here today to talk with everyone about the potential of urban trees and urban green space in providing ecosystem services, and to talk about a lot of the work that's been done in Diane Pataki's lab in understanding urban trees and green spaces. Currently there's a large movement in many cities across the U.S. and also worldwide to plant a lot of trees. And so there's a lot of public-private partnerships that are occurring with the goal of planting and caring for many new trees in urban environments. And a lot of this sort of movement is being fueled by the idea that there are many possible environmental benefits that urban trees can provide, such as climate change mitigation. Trees can provide habitat for native and rare species. They also provide aesthetic cultural services, and there's a potential for erosion control as well. And so a lot of these collective environmental benefits are known as ecosystem services. And this was a concept that was popularized by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in the early 2000s. And they categorized ecosystem services into provisioning services like food and water, regulating services like climate regulation and water purification, cultural services like spiritual and recreational benefits, and supporting services like photosynthesis and nutrient cycling. And so we know that urban trees and urban forests have the potential to provide a lot of these services, but it's also important to consider the potential ecosystem disservices or the costs that could be entailed to the economy and society. So there could be economic costs associated with things like pest control, or costs associated with the removal of fallen debris. There could be health issues that are stemmed from pollen from trees, and this could cause allergies and other sort of health issues. Some people sort of have this sense of decreased safety sometimes with increases in urban trees because it obscures the view, and they maybe have more fear of more criminal activity. And there could also be environmental costs like associated with increased water use. So it's important to consider not only ecosystem services, but also disservices that could be potentially associated with urban trees. And so for this talk today, we're going to focus on sort of the effects of trees, urban trees and urban green space on climate, especially in urban environments. And these effects could be positive or negative, and that could depend on species or site conditions or many other factors. And so first we'll talk about carbon sequestration, or the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by trees through that occurs during photosynthesis. We'll also talk about greenhouse gas emissions from urban green spaces, and that would include carbon dioxide emissions that can occur, such as with declining forests or degraded soils, and also nitrous oxide emissions that occurs from fertilized landscapes. I'll also talk about the effects of trees on energy balance of an ecosystem through shading, evaporative cooling, and the indirect effects on building energy use. And lastly, we'll talk about how trees can modify hydrology through absorption of stormwater and groundwater, and by altering the water balance of an ecosystem. And so we'll talk about all four of these and how urban trees or an urban green space can affect climate and urban environments. So, so how do we know that, or how can we assess the ability of urban trees to provide sort of the intended ecosystem services that we have for them? And one way is to measure. Scientists that we can use to do this. And so it's important to study urban trees and forests and to measure a lot of these sort of services. But when we do this, we have to consider sort of the place that we're in. So ecosystem services could be very specific to a place. And for example, how trees would affect the climate or the water balance in cities will depend on the regional climate as well as where the species is normally to. So whether trees are planted in sort of a naturally wet climate and an arid system. And so when we add trees to arid or semi-arid areas, this could be costly in terms of water use. And so it's important to consider the species that we use and the place that we're looking at when we're trying to determine ecosystem services provided by urban trees. And so first, let's talk about the carbon sequestration potential of urban green spaces and urban trees. And so we know that trees remove atmospheric carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, and that plants are made up of about 50% of their biomass is carbon, so a lot of carbon is stored in plants. And a lot of this carbon is stored in long-lived plant tissues like woody biomass. And that as plant tissues nest like leaves or as woody debris falls, that these carbon sources are added to the soil. And soils can accumulate a lot of carbon over time. And actually in terrestrial environments, soils are store the majority of the carbon, and so they're very important for carbon sequestration as well. So to sort of assess carbon sequestration potential of urban trees and to what extent urban trees can sequester carbon, it's important that we measure the carbon stored in trees and soils, and to also consider how that compares relative to the amount of carbon dioxide produced or the amount of carbon emissions in urban environments. So a study by Pataki et al. That was conducted here in Salt Lake County to do this. And so this is a diagram of the model that they used. And basically they used this model to predict sort of the future net carbon emissions in the area. And they used sort of the role of climate and urban expansion, urban form, transportation, and the urban forest, and all of those factors together to see how they would influence net carbon emissions. And so they used this model to predict the capacity of carbon sequestration by trees to offset urban carbon dioxide emissions. And so they did sort of a bold simulation where they doubled the rate of tree planting on new land. And we can see this as an increase in the number of trees, which is the red solid line, versus the dotted red line, and an increase in the biomass, which is the solid green line, compared to the dotted green line. So that's the increase in the trees and the biomass in this sort of simulation over time. And what they found is that after 50 years, this increase in the trees offset about 0.2% of the annual carbon dioxide emissions. So that's not really a lot of offset. So, we know that sort of the urban photosynthesis that's occurring is sort of small in comparison to the fossil fuel combustion that happens in urban environments. And, we know this because fundamentally urban photosynthesis is just really very small in terms of energy in comparison to fossil fuels. That's because fossil fuels, are millions of years old, and so they have a lot of sort of concentrated energy. And modern photosynthesis by urban trees is just not comparable to that as far as energy output. And so, in addition, the amount of space that's available to plant trees in urban environments is not really high enough to offset carbon dioxide emissions in cities. And so urban planting may not be an effective strategy for carbon sequestration. So now let's sort of turn our attention and talk a little bit about urban green space effects on other greenhouse gases in addition to carbon dioxide. So I talked about how important soils are in storing carbon in terrestrial ecosystems. And in this study, they looked at urban parks, and they studied ornamental lawns and athletic fields in these parks and looked at soil carbon accumulation. And so the ornamental lawns represent areas like picnicking areas, things like that, whereas the athletic fields are like soccer fields and other things like that. And so the soccer fields start out with, sort of a high organic carbon, and this is primarily because they're imported turf, and so you're getting carbon inputs that are coming from outside the system, whereas the ornamental lawns were established from seed on existing soil. And what we see is that in a relatively short period of time, there's a significant accumulation of carbon in the ornamental lawns, which are not disturbed compared to the athletic fields. So the athletic fields are typically tilled or aerated or resodded, ripped up turf every year. And so you don't get accumulations in carbon in the athletic fields, but you can get significant accumulation in a more undisturbed soil. So soils can accumulate a lot of carbon, but they can also emit a lot of greenhouse gases. So nitrous oxide, or N2O, is a greenhouse gas with significant global warming potential. So compared to carbon dioxide, like on a molecule, of carbon dioxide compared to a molecule of N2O, it has 300 times the ability to trap heat in the atmosphere. So it's a very potent greenhouse gas. And nitrous oxide is produced naturally in the soil during microbial processes like, nitrification and denitrification and things like that. And fertilized soils can, have increased microbial processing occur in the soil. And so this study, they looked at nitrous oxide emissions from the soil after fertilization, and they saw that fertilized soils can emit significant quantities of N2O, and you see there's a sort of a spike in the nitrous oxide emissions within 5 days after fertilization. So what you can do is you can sort of look at all of the greenhouse gases emitted from urban parks and do sort of a comparison between greenhouse gases that would have net warming effects. So in this study, they looked at the natural emissions of the nitrous oxide coming from the soil, and they also considered carbon dioxide emissions that would occur with maintenance of the lawn. So, for example, during irrigation, there's energy costs associated with pumping of the water. With fertilization, you have carbon dioxide emitted during the production of the inorganic fertilizer, and there's also emissions associated with transport and application of fertilizers. And they compared this with the offset potential of soil organic carbon accumulation. And so for things that would have a potential warming effect, they would be shown as positive or above the zero And for things that would have a cooling effect or would be able to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, they would be shown below the line, below the zero or is negative. And so the y-axis is showing the global warming a potential of the lawn. And what they found is that the ornamental lawn has low fertilization rates, that basically it is carbon neutral. So the amount of carbon that's accumulated in the soil is equivalent to the amount of naturally occurring nitrous oxide emissions and the carbon dioxide emissions that occur from maintenance. Whereas with increased fertilization, you do not see this. You actually start to see a net warming effect. And additionally, in the athletic fields where there's no sort of carbon accumulation occurring in the soil, there is a net warming effect from nitrous oxide emissions and from carbon dioxide due to maintenance practices. So how we manage our urban lawns and parks, as well as our own private spaces, could have a large impact on climate change. And inorganic fertilizer application is sort of could increase, sort of the emissions or greenhouse gas contributions. So let's, look more closely at the potential cooling effect of green spaces and of energy balance. So the good news is that we know that urban trees can provide a significant cooling effect. And so this is an interesting study. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a graph missing on the right there. But basically what it shows, this was a study that was conducted in Los Angeles, California, and where they used satellite imagery to relate daytime air temperature to the percent tree cover. And what they found was a significant decrease in air temperature with increasing tree cover. So what should be showing on the right-hand side is a graph with a linear line going down. So basically as air temperature is decreasing, the more tree cover that you have, the more trees that are put into the urban environment, there was lower air temperatures. And so there are a lot of ways, that trees can sort of provide this cooling effect. And so most of us will think about shading. And trees do provide shading, and that does help cool, but there's also some other ways they can affect air temperatures. And one of them is through the cooling due to transpiration, and that's the process of water evaporation from the leaves, and that's shown in the blue arrow. And another way would be through reflection. So trees can reflect heat, or it's also called albedo effect. That's the reflecting power of a surface. And so maybe lighter colored leaves could also reflect more heat, so that could be another way. So there's a couple of different ways that trees can sort of impact air temperatures and contribute to this cooling. And this could have, implications for energy demand. So in this study, what they looked at was daily energy demand, which is shown on the y-axis, and they related to the average daily temperature, which is shown on the x-axis. And what you can see is, at low temperatures you have a little bit higher energy demand, and that's probably due to heating during cool times. And then you kind of levels off, and there's get high, you get a really high increase in energy demand, most likely due to cooling or air conditioning costs. And so, as I showed before, that when you have this increase in tree cover, you can decrease daily temperatures. And so this could be associated with a reduction in the daily energy demand. So trees could have a large cooling effect, which it could also be associated not only with the direct cooling that they could do, but also indirectly by reducing carbon dioxide emissions that would be associated with air conditioning use. So, how we manage the forests can be different. If we're trying to sort of manage for decreased energy use or increased cooling versus trying to maybe maximize carbon sequestration. So, it's important to consider the cooling effect and relative to the carbon sequestration potential. And so, trees providing this, cooling benefit could be very important, and it might be a more important strategy for managing our urban forests. So in addition to that, let's think about then sort of green space and urban trees and how that relates to water resources. And so a big question then is, how much water do large urban street trees actually use? There's not a lot of evidence of exactly how much trees do use, and not a lot of measurements on big trees along streets or in yards. But one thing we need to consider when we try to think about this is the species composition of the urban forest. And this study in Los Angeles found species from all over the world in Los Angeles. And how these species will react or behave when they're transplanted is important to understand. So how will a species that is, used to a music or wet environment react when it's planted in a desert? And this is actually, not easy to predict. So in this figure, what we're looking at is transpiration on the y-axis, and that's the amount of water movement through the trees. And on the x-axis is the evaporative demand, or you can think of this as how dry the environment is, or atmosphere is. So as the air is drier, what we expect to see is more transpiration occurring. And so that's sort of that first sort of jump up in the curve. And then at some point, this levels off because you expect trees to have some control over this, or over how much water they lose. But then what will happen with some different species as they're transported is not necessarily intuitive. So for example, Norway maple is a very commonly planted tree here, but it is native to humid environments. So as the air becomes drier, will the species exhibit more water use? That would be the dotted line on the top. So would transpiration just continue to increase as the air becomes drier? Or would the tree show more control over water loss? And that would be maybe the straight line, the straight dotted line going off to the right. Or could the tree just fail? So it's hard to know, how would these trees respond when they're placed in a different environment? So tree water use can be very different among species and not necessarily easy to predict. So fortunately, though, we have methods that we can use to actually measure tree water use, and even in very large street trees. And so this diagram is showing the method that is used. And basically what you can do is place two sensors or two probes into the sapwood. That's the conducting tissue in the bark, and you can measure the sap flux. And the way this works is that the bottom sensor is unheated, and the top sensor is heated. And the difference in the temperature between the two sensors is an indicator of how fast the water is moving or how much water the tree is using. So if water is moving fast, there'll be a small difference in the temperature between the two probes. And if water is moving slow or not at all, let's say like at nighttime, then there would be a large difference in the temperature between the two probes. So here is some data to show what that looks like. So this data is showing data, or these two graphs, these sets of graphs are showing data for over a 1 day time period for 5 different species. So the top two graphs are showing transpiration rate, and the bottom two are showing the vapor pressure deficit, or BPD. And the vapor pressure deficit is the difference between the amount of moisture that's in the air and how much moisture the air can actually hold when it's saturated. And ecologists use this because it has a linear relationship with transpiration rate, typically. And so what we can see is that as the evaporative demand increases, or as the air, you can think of this as the air is drier, the VBT is higher on the bottom two panels, that transpiration is also increasing. So these species are reacting the way you would expect. But what we see is that there's differences in how these species are responding to increased vapor pressure deficit in dry areas in their transpiration rates. So what we did was we conducted a study that measured transpiration rates on several different species and in several locations across the LA area to try to understand sort of the water use of different species of trees in a dry city. And we took measurements on street trees, and here are a couple figures that show what that data would look like. And so in these figures, each bar represents the average daily transpiration rate. And so you can look at data over several months and see how the species may be similar or how they may be different in transpiration rates over time. And additionally, in these figures, we sampled 3 more species at the LA Police Academy, and these species have very different, you can see that they have very different transpiration rates, even in the same location. So they're responding quite differently to the atmosphere. And so what we can see is that species differences in water use can be quite large. And so on the y-axis here, we are looking at average daily transpiration rate in August, so across the month of August. And this is when you expect transpiration rates to peak or be the highest. And so what we see is that species really does matter in their water use. So, for example, London plane tree has high transpiration or water use. It's all the way on the right side in the red, compared to, let's say, lace bark or rose gum that are in blue in the middle, and they have very low daily transpiration rates. And we also had a few species that were located in unirrigated places in LA. And so what we did is we used this data to model whole stand transpiration. And so in this figure, what we're looking at on the x-axis is the tree density, or the number of trees per hectare. And on the y-axis, we're looking at the modeled transpiration rate for the whole stand. And so we know that water use in urban forests is determined by the number of trees per area, or the tree density, and the type of species, and that this can be sort of highly variable. And so another thing I want to point out is that what we did in the models, we grouped species into ranges that had similar transpiration rates for clarity. So we have species that had high transpiration rates, like sycamore and honey locust, and species with medium transpiration rates and low transpiration rates, as well as the few that were unirrigated. So there were some places, surprisingly, I guess, in LA where they didn't irrigate, and some of these species could withstand this sort of very low water input. And so what we see from this figure, so the maximum transpiration rate was around 2, and that's close to what you would see in sort of a wet eastern forest, even though there's a lot lower tree density. So the tree density maximum we have here is somewhat of what the maximum you could see in an urban forest. And this is a lot lower than what you would see in an eastern forest, even with similar transpiration rates. And so this could be due to a couple factors. The first one is irrigation. So a lot of times we see that soils remain very moist, and so there's plenty of water, so they could just be continuing to use this water. And also that the vapor pressure deficit is high, so it's about 3 times higher. So that dry air will just, for some species, they'll react by continuing to transpire the water. And so, one question you have from this is, do low water users have slow growth? So a lot of times what we would like to find or use in an urban environment is we would like to have trees that are low water users but may also have fast growth, because a lot of times what you do see is that low water users have a tendency to be slow growers, and that's not maybe necessarily what you would like to have. So can we find species that are water efficient? You know, they have low water use relative to their growth. And so we measured growth rate using dendrometer bands and measured water use using the sap flow measurements like I discussed before. And what we found is that some species use quite a bit of water but also have slow growth. For example, the honey locust shown in the right-hand side with the open circle. So it has a lot of water use, but the actual growth is low. But we also found that there are some that are actually very water efficient, and so they had higher water use, but they also had a lot higher stem area growth. And so it's possible that these species are actually adapted to drier climates initially. And so this last study that I'm going to talk about is was also conducted in LA, and they looked at the transpiration rate of the actual lawn or the grass. So they used chambers on the ground to look at water use of the lawn. And they did this in lawns that had trees, and they also did this in lawns that did not have any trees. And what we see is on the y-axis is the total transpiration or water use in the lawn. And the yellow bars are representing the water use of the grass in areas that did not have any trees, so sort of an open, sunny lawn without trees. And the dark red bars are showing the grass water use in areas or in lawns that had trees. And then we added the tree transpiration in the open bars on top of those red bars. So that is including in these lawns that had the trees, the water use by the trees as well. And so what we see is that the lawns that had trees, even when you combine the water use of the lawn and the tree together, that total water use is lower than just the water use of the lawn in an open sunny lawn. So this shading from the trees could help reduce the water use of lawns. And so planting trees in lawns could be a water-saving measure. And so there's sort of a, here's a summary of some of the things that we do sort of know about urban tree ecosystem services up to this point, but there's also things that we're still uncertain about. So for example, with carbon sequestration, there is what you would consider a low level of uncertainty currently about how much trees can sequester carbon in the urban environment. And we also sort of know that this potential of them to sequester carbon is a low magnitude. And additionally, if you look at like an ecosystem disservice, there's a low level of uncertainty of, the allergens, or sources of allergens from urban trees, but the potential magnitude of those urban, allergens could be high. And on the other hand, there are some things that we really still don't know a lot about, so there's a high level of uncertainty. So for example, an ecosystem service that we talk about, air quality mitigation, there's still a high level of uncertainty about the ability of urban trees to provide this service. We don't have a lot of empirical data or research that has actually looked at the direct effect of urban trees on air quality. And a lot of ecologists expect that the potential magnitude of this would also be relatively low, but we really don't know yet, so that's an uncertainty. And also an uncertainty about sort of the level, if we look at the disservice, the net greenhouse gases that could be emitted from urban trees or urban green spaces, sort of the level of uncertainty about that is high, but we expect that this magnitude could be moderate. So in conclusion, these are the things that we've learned so far through our work and through our research, is that, so the direct carbon sequestrations in urban trees is unlikely to be effective for climate mitigation, and that's primarily because the sequestration of carbon in trees is relatively low to the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted in urban environments. So it's really difficult for trees to offset this amount of emissions. We have also learned that fertilized landscapes can make this sort of climate problem worse by with this additional nitrogen to the soil. You get increases in the nitrous oxide emissions from soil that naturally occur, and you also get increases in carbon dioxide emissions due to the maintenance practices that are used on fertilized landscape, like from the pumping of your irrigation water, CO2 that's produced during the production of inorganic fertilizers, as well as transport and applying fertilizers. So how we manage our landscapes can have a big impact. The good news is that urban trees do have a large cooling effect, and there are several different ways that urban trees can do this. They can do it directly through the evaporative cooling, like transpiration, but they can also do it indirectly through energy savings. By cooling the environment, you can also reduce potentially the energy demand used for air conditioning in hot weather. And we've also learned that urban trees vary greatly in their water use efficiency. So some trees can be very water use efficient, whereas others are not. And we've also learned that in some cases trees can lower the water use in the total landscape. So like we saw in that last study, that lawns that had trees actually used lower water. And so we can select species to meet our needs for modifying, water use and climate from what we have learned. And so, many sort of urban ecologists are starting to talk about, putting the right tree in the right place. And it's our hope that, some of the work that we're doing to try to understand how different species modify, water use and climate, that we can use what we've learned to help people manage urban forests. And so with that, we want to thank many collaborators and students and postdocs that have contributed to all of this work, as well as the funding sources for this work. And I would be happy to take any questions.